Dairy Queen, Chapter 1 through Chapter 7. Chapter 1, Schwenk Farm. This whole enormous deal wouldn't have happened, none of it, if Dad hadn't messed up his hip moving the manure spreader. Some people laugh at that, like Brian did. The first time I said manure spreader he bent in half, he was laughing so hard, which would have been hilariously funny except that it wasn't. I tried to explain how important a manure spreader is, but it only made him laugh harder. In this really obnoxious way he has sometimes. Besides, you're probably laughing now too. So what? I know where your milk comes from and your hamburgers. I always remember the day it all started because Joe Nimmath was so sick. Dad names all his cows after football players. It's pretty funny actually going to the 4-H fair where they list the cows by farm and name. Right there next to Happy Valley Buttercup is Schwenk Walter Payton, because none of my grandpas or great-grandpas could ever come up with a name for our place better than boring old Schwenk Farm. Joe Namath was the only one left from the year Dad named the cows after Jets players, which I guess is kind of fitting in a way, seeing how important the real Joe Namath was in all. Our Joe was 11 years old, which is ancient for a cow, but she was such a good milker and calver we couldn't help but keep her. These past few weeks, though, she really started falling, and on this morning she wasn't even at the gate with the other cows waiting for me. She was still lying down in pasture, and I had to help her to stand up and everything, which was pretty hard because she weighs about a ton, and she was really limping going down to the barn. Her eyes were looking all tired. I milked her first so she could lie down again, which she did right away. Then when milking was over, I left her right where she was in the barn, and she didn't even look like she minded. Smut couldn't figure out what I was doing, and she wouldn't come with me to take the cows back to pasture. She just stood there in the barn, chewing on her slimy old football, and waiting for me to figure out I'd forgotten one of them. Finally she came, just so she could race me back home, like she always does, and block me the way when taught her. Smut was his dog, but now that he's not talking to Dad anymore, or to me, or ever coming home again, it seems like I guess now she's mine. When I went in for breakfast, Curtis was eating the sports section and eating something that looked kind of square and flat and black, like roof then shingles. Curtis will eat anything because he's growing so much. Once he complained about burnt scrambled eggs, but other than that he just shoves it in, which makes me look like I'm being all picky about stuff that, trust me, is pretty gross. Dad handed me a plate and shuffled back to the stove with his walker. When things got really bad last winter with his hip, and Mom working 2 jobs and me doing all the farm work, because you can't milk 32 cows with a walker, Dad decided to chip in by taking over the kitchen. But he never said I'm going to start cooking or I'm not too good at this. How could I do it better or anything like that? He just started putting food in front of us and then yelling at us if we said anything, no matter how bad it looked, like now. It's French toast, Dad said, like it was totally obvious. He hadn't shaved in a while. I noticed his forehead was white the way it always be from all those years of wearing a feed cap, while his chin and nose and neck were getting so tan. I forced down a bite. It tasted kind of weird and familiar. What's in here? Cinnamon. Cinnamon? Where you get that idea? The Food Channel. He said it really casual, like he didn't know what it meant. Curtis and I looked at each other. Curtis doesn't laugh, really. He's the quietest one in the family. Next to him, I sound like Oprah Winfrey or something. He makes Mom cry sometimes. He's so quiet, but he was grinning. I tried to sound matter of fact, which was hard because I was just about dying inside. How long you been watching the Food Channel, Dad? You watch your mouth. Curtis went back to his paper, but you could tell from his shoulders that he was still grinning. I pushed the shingles around on my plate, wishing I didn't have to say this next thing. Dad, Joe's looking real bad. How bad? Bad, I said. Dad knew what I was talking about. He'd seen her yesterday. I hate it when he acts like I'm stupid. We didn't say anything more, sat there forcing down my shingles and doing the math in my head. I had known Joe since I was 4 years old. That's more than 3/4 of my life she's been around. Heck, Curtis was only a baby when she was born. He couldn't even remember her not existing. Thinking stuff like that, there's really not much point to making conversation. After breakfast, me and Curtis disinfected all the milk equipment and worked on the barn the way we have to every day, cleaning out the calf pens and sweeping the aisles and shoveling all the poop into the gutter and the barn floor, then turning on the conveyor belt in the gutter to sweep it out to the manure cart so we can haul it away. Back when Grandpa Warden was alive, the barn just shined, it was so clean. He spread powdered lime on the floor every day to keep everything fresh, and wiped down the light bulbs and the big fans that brought fresh air in, and whitewashed the walls every year. The walls hadn't been painted in a long time, though. I guess Dad was hurting too much these past few years to do any real cleaning, and I sure didn't have the time. So the barn looked pretty crappy and smelled it too. Whenever I passed by Joe McMahon, I'd take a minute to pat her and tell her what a good cow she was, because I had a pretty good idea what was coming. When I heard a truck pull into the yard, I knew it was a cattle dealer coming to take her away. I gave her another pat. I'll be right back, I said, like that would help, and went out to say hello at least. Delayed it. Curtis followed me out because we don't get that many visitors. It wasn't a cattle dealer standing there, though. Dad came out of the kitchen, pushing his walker, this satisfied look on his face. He spotted me. I'm sure you know who this is? Yeah, I did. Curtis right behind me whistled between his teeth, only it wasn't whistling so much as blowing, like the sound bulls make when they're really mad. Because standing in front of his brand new Cherokee in his brand new work boots, looking about as much a part of our junky old farmyard as a UFO, was Brian Nelson. Chapter 2. Put to work. Let me explain. See, Red Bend is my town and my school, and neither one is very big. There are about 130 kids in each grade. 128 of us are starting 11th grade next fall, and if you figure half of them are girls, and some of the skinny boys do cross country, and some of the others have jobs, play club soccer, or I don't know, there's something wrong with them. That leaves about 20 guys to try out for the football team, plus the other three classes, including the freshmen who are mostly still too little, and that you can cut all the players who aren't any good, or kids on JV, and you've got a team that's not the best there ever was. Even with our league playing 8 on 8 instead of 11 players to a side like you see on TV. Well, right next to us is Harley, and Harley has 200 kids in the class, which means that they got almost twice as many guys to make up a football team. And for years, ever since these two towns were named, almost Red Bend and Harley have been enemies. Since they invented football back at Yale and Harvard, Red Bend and Harley have been enemies. I wrote a paper last year on how football was invented, which is why at least I didn't flunk history, and Harley almost always wins everything. That's why I was so mad about having to quit basketball last year, because us Red Bend She-Wolves had already beat the Harley Tigers once, and we probably would have them beat them again. But we lost. I mean, our team lost, but I wasn't on it anymore. I was stuck working both milkings because Dad was so sick, and Red Bend lost in double overtime. That was the only time I ever saw Amber, my best friend, It was the only time I ever saw her cry. Anyway, their football team is really good, and our football team is as good as it can be, considering how small our school is. And the Harley kids, and some Harley grown-ups too, act like we stink and they're the best, which isn't true. 4 years ago, when Wynn was a senior and Bill was a sophomore, Red Ben beat Harley in the most completely amazing football game I've ever seen. My brother Wynn, even though he was quarterback and wasn't even supposed to be kicking, went in the last second to attempt a field goal because this was his last game for Red Ben, and he was just about the best player Red Ben has ever seen, except for my other brother Bill, and he kicked it right through the goalpost, like kicking a football was the only thing in life he ever done, and we won. And well, there isn't really any way I could describe what it was like. How everyone was screaming, and my dad and mom were both crying, and how Wynn was carried around by the whole team, and then right there on everyone's shoulders, he waved his hand up to the clouds because that's what we do to remember our Grandpa Warren, who Wynn was named after. And then I started crying too, and it was just a pretty amazing experience. Sometimes when I started thinking about how screwed up my family is, or when it's cold and I'm milking and the machines won't work, and a cow sticks on my foot, and my hands are so cold, I keep dropping things. Then I remember how I felt at that moment, and I feel a little better. But most of the time, when I think about Harley, all I feel is pissed on. So when Brian Nelson stepped out of his fancy new truck and his fancy new work boots that his mother probably bought him at Walmart, I was just about as angry as I've ever been. Brian Nelson's a Harley quarterback. Harley's backup quarterback, but still. Quarterbacks are always pretty full of themselves, even Wynn was sometimes, though he had a right to be, and Brian Nelson is just about the worst. He gets top grades and his father owns a dealership, so of course he has a new Cherokee, and all the girls are after him, and last year he had scouts looking at him even though he wasn't a starter, because his grades are so good that he raised the team GPA, which coaches always like. But ever since I've been watching him play, ever since junior high, even whenever he fumbles and messes up or gets intercepted, he always right off the bat blames someone else, which is really annoying to me, and I bet it's even annoying to everyone else on his team who's working so hard. He's the very worst that a lazy, stuck-up, spoiled Harley quarterback could be. But there he stood in his fancy new work boots and his Harley football cutoffs and his Harley football t-shirt. "Hey, Mr. Swing, how's your hip doing?" "Not too bad," said Dad, shaking his hand. "You know my daughter DJ and my boy Curtis?" "Hey," Brian nodded at us, and I could see just by the way he moved his head that he was thinking about all those games Harley has won over the years, and about how he had a new truck and new boots, but we were just dumb farmers with a bunch of rusty old machinery and cow manure on our clothes, who couldn't even pass sophomore English because we were so busy with farm work. Well, one of us was anyway. Not that I thought Brian knew about that, but standing there, I sure was aware that I got an F right there on my year-end report card, and that he never would. There was a really long silence. Dad eyeballed me. "DJ, you gonna say hello?" "No." That was great. Sometimes, well, all the time, I can't think of what to say because I am so dumb and stuff, and then maybe I think of it like 5 days later. But I'll remember that one. For the rest of my life, I'll remember that. No. Because if nothing else, it got a little bit of that smirk off Brian's face. There was another long silence. If I have to make this into a movie, I have everyone count to 25 before saying anything. That's how long the silencers wore. Brian cleared his throat. "Jimmy Art thought I could, help you guys out with a hand." "Jimmy Art sent you over?" I asked, very suspicious. He shrugged. "For the day." Dad adjusted his walker. "DJ here will put you to work." Brian shrugged like it didn't matter to him one way or the other, and I shrugged the same way. But I wasn't quite so mad now that I knew Jimmy Aunt had sent him over. I could put Brian to work. Heck, I could sure do that. I jerked my head at Brian to follow me. "You know anything about tractors?" Brian snorted like it was the dumbest question he ever heard. I knew he didn't. How about power takeoffs? He didn't even bother answering that one. Instead, he just patted Smut, who aided up the traitor. What's her name? He asked. Smut. You kidding? That's her name? I didn't bother answering. For a while, Brian stood there watching me hook the hay wagon to the tractor. But it wasn't helpful at all, and besides, I was so busy showing off how good I was that I almost broke my thumb, and then I had to pretend nothing was wrong, which wasn't so great for my mood. He ended up playing tug of war with Smut. Smut would play tug of war for 2 straight weeks until she collapsed of starvation and died. It really ticked me off that she was playing with him instead of staying next to me, getting in my way and sticking her nose in my mouth whenever I bent over. Not that I enjoyed that part, but she was my dog after all. Right when I finished, the cattle dealer pulled in and I went to get Joe. She was still lying in her stall right where I left her, chewing her cud with this really tired look on her face. I thought about the day she was born, how Grandpa Warren let me bottle feed her for a couple days just because bottle feeding is so much fun for little kids. I unhooked her, telling her how great she was and what a great milker she always been, and helped her stand up because her legs didn't work so good, and led her out to the yard one last time. There was nowhere in this universe I was going to let Brian Nelson, of all people, see me get all mushy over a cow. So I just handed her to the cattle dealer, and he loaded her up in his wagon and off he went. Dad and I standing there to see her off. Anyway, that was the last of Shrink Joe the Math. No one said anything for a bit except Brian, who was teasing Smut, trying to pull her rope away, not even interested in what just happened. Dad glared at him. What are you doing? Just hanging out. Hanging out. Dad, let those words rest in the yard for a bit. Hard to believe a guy with a walker could be so scary. Hanging out, eh? You're here to learn how to work, and if you want to start this season, you better get to it. Brian stiffened. Yes, sir, he said, not looking up. In the way, I was sort of sorry for Brian. I sure know what it's like to get both barrels. The only reason Dad got mad was because he was cut up about having to sell Joe. If this was a perfect world, we'd keep her forever and spend $1 million trying to fix her sore legs, and she died of old age in a rocking chair in some pretty green pasture. But this isn't a perfect world. It's Wisconsin, and feed costs money, and vets cost money, and we barely have enough for the healthy cows. And the butcher pays us money for the old cows, and that money feeds the healthy ones. But of course, Dad couldn't say that any more than I could. I could barely figure it out to write it down. So instead, he just beat up on Brian, who deserved it. Dad glared at me. You got a job for him to do? I jumped. Yeah, we're ready to go. I nodded at the tractor. Curtis! Dad hollered. As cut up as I was about Joe, I couldn't help noticing what Dad had said about how Brian needed to work for us if he wanted to be a starter. Learn how to work, that's what Dad said, his exact words. I mean, it was one thing for Jimmy Aunt to send Brian over because we were short-handed haying. But the fact that Brian had to come or he wouldn't get to play football to start, which is a big deal, especially if you want to play college ball, that was different. That explained why Brian even showed up at all. Because it wasn't like he was in love with us or wanted to learn agricultural science. If he had to work for us, if it wasn't kind of test Jimmy Art was giving him, well, that was something else altogether. Jimmy Art, I guess I should explain about him too. He's been the Harley football coach for 29 years. He sells insurance too, but mainly he's just a really good coach and a really good guy. A long time ago, before Dad and Mom even met, and even though Dad had played for Red Bend when he was in high school, Dad and Jimmy coached together. Dad had just gotten out of the Army when he was living here with Grandpa Warren and Grandma Joyce, and the two of them ran the Harley football program. That's how Dad met Mom, because she was new in town teaching at Red Bend. And she went to the Red Bend Harley game because that's what everyone does. And they got to talking, And then they got married. And even after they were married and living in a little house down by the highway, and Win and Bill were born, Dad was still assistant coach. But then Grandma Joyce died, and I was born, and we had to move into this house, and Dad had to quit coaching to work on the farm. And they had to sell the little house off, and then Grandpa Warren died, and Dad got the farm to himself, and he doesn't coach anymore. But he and Jimmy Arndt are still really good friends. And Jimmy Arndt came to see him in the hospital. And he and Kathy Arndt come for dinner a lot. And they bring us Christmas presents because they don't have kids of their own. When I was little, it used to make me confused that we were rooting against Harley, even though Harley was Jimmy Arndt's team. I asked Mom about it once. She said it was because life isn't black and white, which didn't make any sense because Red Ben's colors are black and red, and Harley's colors are black and orange. But later, I learned what black and white meant, and I thought I understood a little bit more. And then I just stopped thinking about it, which I guess is the same thing. Anyway, Jimmy Aunt used to watch us kids hanging or milking or weeding in the garden or playing a pickup game together. And he just shook his head and said to Dad, "Boy, oh boy, you sure did something right. Because us shrinks aren't rich, and we're not that smart, and except for Bill and Mom, and she was thin back before she got married. We nothing to look at. But one thing we can do is work. You want to learn how to work hard? Just look at us. We're about the very best place for a snotty, rich, sit on your butt kid like Brian to go." I began to realize, kind of excited, that if Brian had to help us in order to play football, that meant he'd have to put up with anything I dished out. Yeah, guys, this book is too long, so we're gonna do I'm gonna have to do 2 chapters each for this book. Bye.